Dear friends and colleagues, I will present here the preliminary results of my 3 years long postdoctoral project financed by the Hungarian National Research Council as a postdoctoral OTKA project, which begins in 2018 and will be finished hopefully in January-February 2022. The project aimed to analyze for the first time the Roman religion and the aspects of Roman religious communication in the Danubian provinces, from Raetia till Moesia Inferior, from today Bavaria till the Black Sea, so a very huge macro region of the Roman Empire, going beyond the provincial limits in the analysis of Roman religion, and to identify the major specificities, the so-called glocal specificities of Roman religious communication in this macro region of the Roman Empire. It had also a second aim, which was to map all the archaeologically attested sanctuaries in this region. In this paper, I will make a short resume, a short summary of the project. The first case study I made as a preliminary study of this project was my PhD work between 2012 and 2017, where I analyzed the archaeological material related to Roman religious communication in Dacia, today Romania, mostly Transylvania and Oltenia. So one of the last provinces of the Roman Empire, englobed by this political entity and administrative entity during the age of Trajan, and left in the age of Aurelian. So in less than 160 years in Roman Dacia, we will have around 55 archaeologically attested sacralized spaces, commonly known as sanctuaries, 19 epigraphically attested sanctuaries, and more than 67 presumed sacralized spaces where Roman religious communication was established between human and divine agency. These sanctuaries, this large amount of sacralized spaces, and of course all the archaeological material related to this, was analyzed in my book published in 2018. And it was also mapped for the first time in a digital interactive map. The project, Danubianreligion.com, was aiming to go beyond the provincial limits to analyze Roman religion in a larger macro space, in larger clusters, and to see also how Roman religion can be related, can be analyzed in a global context. So how Roman religion is established on a local level, and of course as part of an empire, this local religious appropriation, local religious communication is shaped and formed, transformed by the universal aspects of Roman religion as a religion of an empire. So this was the major aim of the project, which has similar methods already used in my previous works, focusing on the Roman religion in Dacia and the sanctuaries of Roman Dacia. So basically, this project is a continuation of my previous works, but focusing now on a much larger geographical area and with a more developed, more theoretically more developed and probably better presented theoretical framework, especially focusing on space sacralization. Dealing with such a large area of the Roman Empire, obviously I had serious methodological concerns, problems, and obstacles, questions. First of all, of course, how can we collect the materiality of religion for such a large area? We are talking about 7 provinces: Raetia, Noricum, Pannonia Inferior, Pannonia Superior, Moesia Superior, Moesia Inferior, and Roman Dacia, the Tres Dacie. So it's a large area from Bavaria, Switzerland till the Black Sea, commonly known as Gross Illyricum, or the Danubian area, the Danube provinces, Danubian provinces. So one of the biggest challenge was, of course, collecting the archaeological material itself, which was never done before, systematically focusing on such a large area. Previous researches, of course, which were dealing with the Danubian provinces as a whole or as a macro region, was focusing especially on individual provinces, province clusters such as Lower Danube and Upper Danube, or focusing especially on the so-called Limesforschung, the military aspects and the materiality of the Roman army in these areas. So this, the Limesforschung, which is one of the most developed areas in Central Eastern European Roman studies, usually ignored Roman religion on macro scale. So this was indeed one of the largest, one of the biggest provocations of the work. Second, of course, was the matter of terminology. I introduced several new notions in my previous works from Western scholarships, of course, from Western works focusing on Roman religion in the last 10-20 years, which was unfamiliar for Central Eastern European classical archaeology or Roman provincial archaeology. So it was, of course, a provocation. How can we use these terminological notions, these new words, these new methodological approaches for provinces where our only source are materiality of Roman religion? So there are no literary sources, there are very few unusual or rich epigraphic case studies. We have especially archaeological sources and standard, very insignificant epigraphic sources, which are basically repeating their epigraphic formula. So it was, of course, a provocative question how to define some of the key notions of my research, such as what is a sacralized space, how can we define a sanctuary, of course, that was one of the central questions, what is sacralization, how a space is sacralized, transformed, maintained or abandoned. So what is this process as a transformative act in Roman religion? Of course, also Roman religion itself has a terminological issue and provocation. So there were many notions which I am using in my project which needs a terminological definition. Then, of course, it was also the question of identifying the archaeological sites. Where are these sacralized spaces? How can we identify Roman sacralized spaces? What are the criteria? It was not evident, it was not easy, and it is not self-defined. Where is a sacralized space? What can we name as a templum? What is a sanctuary? What is an edes? What is a lararium? So there are these modern and ancient definitions which often are in conflict or terminological discrepancies. Then, of course, it was also the issue of functionality of objects, functionality of architecture, and the role of the natural environment in the process of space sacralization. So all of these aspects of space sacralization and the material world, how these are interacting and what are the limits of identifying these aspects in the Danubian area. And finally, of course, the big question was and is, what can we do? What want we to do with this material? So we do have now the collected large amount of material evidence. What I want to do with this material? So these were the key questions and the key problems, provocations, concerns of the project, and I hope that as the result or the preliminary results of this project, I could answer some of these problems. Regarding terminology, of course, we do have a history, a rich history, which begins with the legal aspects of Roman religion, where Roman sacralized spaces, the public religion and the private religion were differentiated, often in a very strict contrast with each other by the Roman law and the Roman legal traditions. Especially in the work of Georg Vissova, one of the most important figures in Roman religious studies in the end of the 19th, early 20th century. Roman religion is a legal religion where the space itself and the space sacralization is defined by legal aspects and their delimitation. This presumes also the ownership of the sacralized space. Is it the public? Is it in the ownership of the city? Is it an ownership of a private person? And so on and so forth. This aspect, the legal aspect of space sacralization, is still an ongoing and very provocative issue. There are more and more new studies focusing on the legal aspects of space sacralization, especially now on urban context and on so-called private ownership and the changes, transformations of private ownership on the case studies of Lararia in Pompeii, for example, or other case studies. So these legal aspects can still have some soul in it, so it's still a methodology what we can use, but of course it was or it is now an aspect which we need to go beyond, and we need to speak about Roman religion beyond this legal aspect, because Roman religion is much more than a legal, though to death relationship between gods and humans. The second approach, which is dominating the Roman provincial archaeology, especially in Central Eastern Europe, are the architectural features. Roman religion defined or expressed by architecture. So we are talking about the definition of sacralized spaces through their architectural features. What is a temple? What is an Edes? What is a Fanum? A Celtic Gallo, so-called Gallic Celtic temple? What is a Speleum? And so on. So there are many studies, especially archaeological monographies, archaeological studies focusing on the architectural aspects of sacralized spaces. It is very popular since the 19th century, and it's still ongoing as a methodology which are almost fetishizing the objects, and they have this descriptive methodology describing in very, very high details the object itself, but it doesn't go beyond. Of course, this archaeologically and architecturally focused, material-focused descriptive method was questioned by the processual and post-processual archaeology, which is rarely attestable, and this archaeological theoretical shift in archaeology from the 1970s, 80s is rarely attested actually in Roman studies generally. So at least in Central East Europe, post-processual archaeology in Roman studies is still a necessity to be used. And then we have this new approach of Roman religious studies represented by Jörg Rübke and his school especially, but not only, which analyze somehow exactly from this post-processual archaeological point of view and from a cultural anthropological approach, Roman religion as religion of experience, Roman religion as a religion of communication. And of course, it's focusing especially on the individual and on religious individualization. It gives a chance not only for the objects and to describing objects, describing architectural features, not only to the legal aspects, but it gives a chance and it gives an opportunity to analyze religious experiences, practices, the relationship between humans itself, different levels of society, their interconnectivity, mobility, but also the relationship between objects and humans. So this, let's say, holy trinity of objects, humans, and divine agents. So these three major aspects are interconnected, and analyzing Roman religious communication basically is about the interconnectivity of these three major features: materiality, humans, and divine figures. And all of these three are in a very complex and, of course, locally definable, locally changeable, transformative, and very dynamic communication. So these three aspects, of course, are very important when it comes to define what is a sanctuary and what is a sacralized space. And we will have a different definition from all of these three approaches. So therefore, we cannot give one single definition of space sacralization. However, somehow the synthesis of these three historiographic traditions can be summarized by such a definition, which says that space sacralization is a strategy in religious communication established between human and divine agencies, aiming to establish and maintain a sacralized space through legal, spatial, and material tools. Sacralized spaces have also a sensual intensity of religious experience and a spatial hierarchy, connectivity, material density. So space sacralization, in my definition, is a strategy in religious communication which served to establish a more intense and more dynamic and more dense communication tool between human and divine agencies. And this can have, of course, legal, spatial, and material aspects as well. These three are not in conflict, but actually they are in very well established harmony. To go beyond these three historiographic traditions, I used this spatial taxonomy, which presents the microspaces, the mesospaces, and the macrospaces when it comes to creating a sanctuary, creating a sacralized space. By microspaces, I mean even the human body itself. It can mean also the house shrines, crossroad shrines, corner shrines, a natural garden, a small spring, one single tree, small caves, or even imagined spaces such as an individual dream, a fantasy, or individual epiphanies. It means also mesospaces, human-built material spaces such as assembly houses of small group religions, forests, large caves, rivers, and imagined spaces such as divinations, initiations of several persons. So mesospaces means more persons are involved in space sacralization. So it's also a quantitative level. It's a quantitative category, but it's also the intensity of religious experience is getting higher, or it's different. Not necessarily higher, but definitely different than in microspaces. And of course, in macrospaces, we have complex sanctuaries, pilgrimage sites, large public temples, where, for example, architectural and legal features are more pronunciated, are more important than in the previous two categories. We have natural, large macro natural spaces, entire forests, mountains, large rivers, personified rivers such as the Danube, of course, macroflora, and so on. So these three categories of space sacralization gives us a chance to see all the spaces actually together in one large complexity, in a large system, and it helps us to understand also the intensity of religious experience, how religious experience is lived in different spaces, and how religious experience has its own material agencies and material tools in all of these categories. Here are these objects where we can use or were used in the maintenance of these sacralized spaces. So all of these objects, of course, plays a very special role in space sacralization and maintaining these sacralized spaces. Going beyond these three categories, I also introduced larger clusters, larger macro spaces, such as cities, provinces, and even extra-provincial clusters. For example, Costume System, the Publicum Portori Illirici, Amber Road, or many other types of commercial, financial communication systems, pilgrimage routes, and so on. So these large extra-provincial clusters, but also even the province as artificial limits, administrative limits, and of course the cities as administrative, cultural, demographic entities have their own role in religious communication. So these larger macro spaces were introduced as some new elements in my space theory, in my space taxonomy, and for me at least was very useful to understand some of these larger influences in Roman religious communication. So what we have as sources, we have 7 provinces. I analyzed only the first 3 centuries, so in the so-called Age of Principate till Diocletian. I identified 280 archaeologically attested sacralized space in macro and mesospaces. So I did not include here the smaller microspaces, house shrines, tombs, individual tombs, lararia, or all the other categories, because these are really hard to identify and very problematic to identify in the Danubian provinces. So I was using here only those which are certainly attestable archaeologically. Here, of course, it's also very problematic in some of the cases. What can we archaeologically attest actually? How can we interpret the material? So that's another question. How can we identify a sacralized space when it comes to their material agency? We have 5,700 votive inscriptions used in religious communication, at least after the Heidelberg Epigraphische Datenbank. We have also 7,200 votive inscriptions after the Klaus-Schwabi database. So the large difference between these two numbers reflects their own methodology, their own definition of what is a votive inscription. After the Heidelberg database, they introduced only those inscriptions where there is a divine agency in the inscription, while the Klaus-Schwabi introduced also those inscriptions which are dedicated to divus or diva, the deified emperor or empress. So that's the reason of these large differences. We have also a very interesting contrast between urban and rural. Most of the inscriptions, almost double of the inscriptions, are from urban context. So Roman religion indeed has this very strong urban aspect also in the Danubian provinces, which was, as we know, one of the less urbanized areas of the Roman Empire. I identified almost 260 divinities. From Rhaetia, from Noricum, we have 56 and 72, Pannonia Inferior 97, Pannonia Superior 98, Moesia Superior 63, 16 Moesia Inferior, and almost more than 110 in Dacia. So we have this large amount of divinities, divine figures, personifications in these provinces. Dacia is a particular case study, and very interesting, because it's very short existence, or less than 160 years, almost 100 years shorter than the other provinces, and still the archaeological material is extremely dense, it shows a large variety of divine agency, large variety of visual narratives, and also a unique variety of visual or narrative innovativity. So they are very interesting that in this province, probably because of the demographic composition of the society, one of the most mobile and most complex, ethnographically, culturally most complex provinces in the Danubian area, Dacia was actually a mixture, a kaleidoscope of all the other provinces mentioned before. We have this statistics of the sacralized spaces, of the excavated sacralized spaces. You can see again that except of Pannonia, where we have almost 90 sacralized spaces attested archaeologically, Rhaetia and Dacia is extremely rich and well-attested sanctuaries, and we have less known sanctuaries in Mercia, where of course this reflects also the state of art, the research historiography of each individual modern country. So that doesn't reflect actually the realities of antiquity, but more or less the historiography of the contemporary regions. We have also this statistic big data analysis of all the votive inscriptions. We see here a comparison between the Heidelberg and the Klaus-Schlaby databases. In all of these, however, we see that Roman Dacia and Pannonia are in the first place. They have the most votive inscriptions. But as I said, if we compare in a chronological, historical contextualization, the Roman Dacia indeed is exceptionally rich, because in less than 160 years, they produced almost the same amount of votive inscriptions than Pannonia Inferior and Noricum together. So that is impressive, because the existence of Pannonia, of course, it spans more than 300 years. So this is reflected also here, the number of votive inscriptions in comparison with the totality of epigraphic material. We see here that in most of the provinces, less than 1/3 of the inscriptions are votive, except again Roman Dacia, where almost 40% of the inscriptions are votive. Again, Pannonia Superior has also a large number of votive inscriptions. We have in these 61 urban settlements from the Danubian region, 3 particular settlements are remarkable. These are Carnuntum, Aquincum, and Apulum, the 3 largest legionary centers. All of them have more than 250 votive inscriptions. Carnuntum is exceptional by its quantity, more than 600 votive inscriptions. So the 3 cities together have more votive inscriptions than some provinces altogether, like Noricum or the 2 Mercia. So these are really exceptional hubs, and the density of religious materiality in these 3 cities are really exceptional, even on imperial scale, I would say, because not only from the Danubian region, but from a larger area, even from Germany, Switzerland, even from Italy, there are very few cities in the age of the Principate where we have more than cities, urban settlements with more than 50 votive inscriptions. So Carnuntum, Aquincum, and Apulum are really exceptional hubs of Roman religiosity. The 3 cities together have the same impact on Roman religion as the capital of the empire itself. Chronologically, when analyzing the large amount of epigraphic material produced in this period, we see here let's say what the literature already said, that in the 2nd, 3rd century we have this so-called epigraphic boom. So most of the chronologically sure and datable inscriptions are from the 2nd century and early 3rd century, after which we will have a decay, and in some cases in the end of the 3rd, beginning of the 4th century, there are a new kind of renaissance of Roman religiosity. When it comes to individual divinities, so when we analyze the divine agency in the Danubian provinces as a macro-region, we observe the extreme popularity of the so-called elective cults or small group religions, especially Mithras and Dolihenus are very, very rich in this region, in Noricum and Dacia especially, but also the two Pannonia. The categorization of these divinities are almost identical in every province. So we have Mithras and Dolihenus in the first place, and after that, very few inscriptions dedicated to Magna Mater or Isis or the Egyptianized, Orientalized gods. Jupiter, of course, is the most popular divinity in all of the Danubian provinces. However, the number of inscriptions are very different in these provinces. We have an exceptional number of votive inscriptions dedicated to Jupiter Optimus Maximus in Pannonia Superior, Pannonia Inferior, and Dacia. The most militarized provinces, this cult is particularly related to the fidelity of the Roman Empire, to the official Roman religion or the representative public Roman religion of the army. So that is, let's say, a Visovian heritage, which we can use indeed this public religion and this legal aspects of Roman religion. When it comes to Aesculapius and Hygieia, however, and all the other divine agents, actually, we will see different methods and different approaches which will be useful to analyze the results of the big data. So Visova in these cases are rarely useful. So we need to have a local approach and not a global or so-called Reichsreligion approach. We need to analyze locally why such divinities like Aesculapius are so popular in Roman Dacia and almost completely missing in Rhaetia Noricum. So these are indeed very interesting aspects, how these divinities are worshipped in epigraphic tools, and of course what are the reasons, what are the strategies, what are the alternatives of such a divinity in each case study. The same is true for Liber Pater. You can see here a large number of epigraphic material dedicated to Liber Pater in Roman Dacia and in Pannonia Inferior. The case of Silvanus and Silvanus Domesticus, extremely popular in Pannonia Superior and then in Roman Dacia. And again, we have very few cases in the western part of the Danubian region. So as a consequence, in my book, which will be published hopefully in 2022, I will use all of these theoretical approaches I mentioned here. The first large chapter of the book, after the methodological introduction, will present the pre-Roman religion and how emerging Roman religion changed pre-Roman realities. Roman religion here in the first century AD is interpreted as a so-called reinvented religious traditions. So Roman religion as somehow a unifying force of the Roman Empire, which changed radically the local religious traditions, but did not let's say unified. It doesn't destroyed or we cannot use anymore like a syncretism in Roman religion, because it is much more complex when it comes to local appropriations. And I presented several case studies where these reinvented traditions are very popular in this emerging Roman elite or Romanized elite in the Danubian region. It produced also Roman religion, the emerging Roman religion in this region produced also new and unusual visual narratives and new divine agencies, such as the so-called Dominus et Domna or the Danubian rider, as some new religious agency. The book has also a large chapter focusing on macro spaces, especially large clusters. I mentioned here the Publicum Portori Lyrici, the Amber Root, and many others. It also has a chapter on urban religion, how city defines Roman religion and what are the impact of cities on Roman religious experiences and communication strategies. The fora, the complex sacralized spaces, pilgrimage sites in the Danubian Provinces. Then I have a chapter on military spaces, especially the Principiae and the Edes Signorum. What were the role of Roman religion for the army? Is it Roman religion indeed a military religion in the Danubian region or not? And of course, I have a large chapter on mesospaces too. Mesospaces for small group religions, especially Mitrea, Dolyhena, assembly houses of small group religions, so-called elective cults, which are predominantly rich and very, very significant in this region of the Roman Empire. My chapter on microspaces, as I mentioned, is one of the, let's say, less developed part of the book and my project, because it is indeed shows the limits of historiography, shows the limits of Central East European archaeology, and the limits of theory also. When we have only archaeological material, it is really hard to reach that level of religious individualization, that level of religious experience, which we can, let's say, identify in Pompeii or Rome or other spaces, macro spaces, cities, especially well tested archaeologically. As a conclusion, the book and my project, of course, was a good example, and I learned that terminology and methodology indeed matters. It is an important fact how archaeological sites are excavated, what levels of archaeology can tell us about the details. So the systematic excavations are extremely important because it can tell us many small details on this aspect. It's also important to introduce an interdisciplinary interpretation of the material. There is a necessity in Central East Europe to communicate between different disciplines such as epigraphy, archaeology of religion, religious studies, provincial archaeology. So it is essential to have now an interdisciplinary dialogue between these disciplines, which doesn't exist till now in Central Eastern European archaeological traditions. It is also important to understand Roman religion as a global religion, to focus on space sacralization and Roman religious communication, not only individually, locally, but also to introduce all these spatial aspects I mentioned here. And of course, from my book aims also, and the project itself, to establish an academic network between researchers in Central East Europe to focusing on Roman religion, because the amount of material showed me that it's impossible to have a one-man project. It's impossible to have a synthesis of this large amount of archaeological material. And it will be essential to establish an academic network of Central East European scholars.